So, hello and welcome, guys. Cyber Diaries. We have episode number 16. Time's flying when you're having fun. So, we have another great episode and another great guest in our midst. So, we have James Bohr from Bohr's, and I'll let you obviously, James, introduce yourself. You do so many weird and wonderful things outside of just, running your own consultancy. So, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, I wanted to, I guess, it's always fascinating, to talk to people who, run their own businesses, who do, so much for community. So I guess, there's probably a few people who, it's a shame who haven't heard about James Bohr, but I guess there are a few people who haven't. So, if you can kind of shine a bit of a light what you do, what does, Bohr's group does and, and some of the other things that you are involved in, in extracurricular activities.
Yeah. So Bohr's Group has been around since 1988. I took it over about 4 years ago. Yeah, 4 years ago now. And it's a family consultancy business. We do technology and security. My whole career before that was in security and technology, shockingly, for somewhere over 20 years. And that's what we do. It is security and technology advisory services, bits and pieces around content creation. So I do a lot of writing. We do public speaking stuff. I do public speaking coaching because I speak far more than anyone really should. But mostly it is on the security side for various clients, helping them with building a security stance rather than a posture, understanding technology risks, and anything in between.
Brilliant. Sounds good. Um, you just mentioned a bit about, a stance, and I guess, talking about pragmatic approaches, I'm always fascinated to talk to people because, I think obviously in cybersecurity, and I'm, keen to hear your thoughts, but too many times I think, in various forums I hear, the main chatter is usually, oh guys, I'm looking to do this. Which is the best tool, or what you guys think about that tool or this tool? And I'm always fascinating how much time we spent on tooling or technology without, talking about actually putting people and processes in place to manage that technology in the first place.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems we have as an industry in cybersecurity is the overinvestment and the over reliance on tooling, because ultimately anything security related comes down to people. So the people are the thing you've got to work on first. They're the thing you've got to develop first. Throwing tools at the problem doesn't actually help.
Yeah. How do you find though, like when you do, for example, client engagements, if, as you say, if someone has a point of view that, they're looking for a silver bullet to solve their problems, do you find that education piece difficult, talking with potential clients?
It can be. There are people at the moment who've decided that AI filling in questionnaires is the answer to all their problems. There are people who've decided machine learning, watching their seam is the answer to everything. And really, what that tells me is they haven't thought through what they actually need out of it. They're just saying, I've been told this will solve my problem, so that's fine. They've not dived into the problem. So, generally, when we have those conversations, if we're being brought in, first of all, it's because someone's starting to think, oh, maybe technology isn't the one and only solution. So, for me, it's often a lot easier. It's someone going, oh, wait, my organization has a problem and I keep on throwing technology at it and it doesn't seem to go away. So, maybe I should talk to someone about it. So it's often easier for me, but I can see that's a struggle, particularly for people within organizations where the answer is, oh, well, you just need to spend a few more million on this solution or that solution, and then everything will be fine.
Yeah, and I think sometimes on a broader spectrum, I think, I always say to people, sometimes it's so hard because I say people are looking for silver bullet or asking, how they have implemented specific tool or how do they find specific tool in the organization. And the problem is, I think sometimes it's very hard to evaluate this because you are lacking context because a tool A in organization B does not mean that tool A in organization C will have the similar output. And I think that's where sometimes people really struggle to understand that, what it works for one organization, it doesn't mean that it's going to work for another organization based on plethora of, features and controls and requirements.
I mean, 90% of the time, if I'm going in, the organization has all of the tools they actually need. They're just not using them. They've just deployed them and hoped they'd solve the problem and not thought it through, not worked it through, not developed how to actually make the best use of them, how to tie them together with people. And so they're often going, well, we've spent all this money on these tools. What do we need to buy next to solve it? Instead of how do we actually use the stuff we've got? How do we make that work for the people we have so that we don't need to buy the next one?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem with that, and I'll give you one example. I don't remember where I went. I was in a recent somewhere in one of the conferences. Obviously, you get to chat with your peers, and the person obviously whether you like it or not, in some organizations, obviously there are people in IT who inherit security, and he said, oh, I bought this thing called E5. Have you heard about it? We're using this for security. And I think the problem is sometimes, even though whether you like it or not, E5 or Microsoft Security, is that actually to leverage it to its 100% capabilities, it's a big technical task. It's not easy. There is various platforms and portals where you need to configure everything, and and as you say, actually sometimes it's even you find that it's not that probably often where actually organizations, instead of deploying new tools, actually measure efficacy of their tools and controls, and actually trying to find saving the buck and saying, look, instead of buying a new tool, maybe we should improve the current tooling that we currently have. And maybe instead of, maybe 70% of its deployment, we should strive for 100.
Yeah, and it's not just tooling. I mean, we get the same thing with policy frameworks. So the number of times I've worked with a client and looked at their ISMS, often built around ISO 27001, and what they've done over the years is gone, what do we need to add to hit our targets for ISO 27001? At no point has anyone gone, what do we actually not need from this? What can we take away? What of this is just extra work for no particular reason except that we decided it was once and it's been approved ever since? So it's the same with technology. It's these are tools. If your toolbox is getting too heavy, it's going to weigh you down. You need to slim it down to what you actually need day to day.
Yeah, and I think it's very, I wrote a post recently, and I think, I was talking with someone in event yesterday, and I think it really resonates. You have to spend proportionally to your risk, and I always say, especially if you are working in SME market, I think, there is, I see the emergence sometimes, the 80-20 rule. So how with 20% of the spending and 20% of controls, how you can mitigate 80% of the risk? Because your goal is, you're not trying to build a Fort Knox. You're trying to be secure enough so the threat actors go to the next place.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, particularly if we're looking at SME, one of the biggest tragedies of our industry is fear, uncertainty, and doubt is often used to sell to SMEs. And most SMEs can afford to have a much larger risk appetite than the average business. They're agile, they're small, so being small brings resilience with it. They can actually take on a lot more risks so long as they understand it and do it deliberately than a larger organization can. And the problem is they're constantly sold these solutions, whether they're technology, whether they're policy, whether they're regulations that fit those larger businesses of thousands of people. And if you try to cram that into a three-person business, it doesn't fit.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for them. It just crushes them under its weight.
Yeah, I actually wanted to pick up on something and get your thoughts on it. So, sometimes organizations, obviously, due to their size or due to their, decision making, sometimes seek to outsource parts of their cybersecurity program or services. And one of the probably most common ones is whether you call it MDR, XDR, or SOC services, or however you want to call it. I think sometimes, and I've noticed that a lot, especially now, I've done some work in, architecting and building sort of frameworks around how SOC should be built. But I was helping one of my friends in Australia. So the client of theirs bought a SOC, and obviously as a service, but it's fully outsourced service. And I will hear your thoughts, but I never think you should 100% outsource. You should always supplement with at least one or two people to provide business context. But secondly, is most of these services are bought and configured and left there to be. And the problem is then unless you're doing continuous improvement, that service becomes rendered, useless. Because what happened basically, they bought pen testing services from my friend's company. They did a pen testing, they exploited their financial application, and SOC didn't hear about anything. They were none the wiser of what happened. So what do you think about
It
in those
happens. You,
instances?
I mean, there's a reason we call it continuous improvement. It is a continuous reevaluation. Security isn't a solution. Security is a continuous program of work that you have to do to be secure. And being secure means you've got an acceptable level of risk for you. And it might be you've got too little and need to bump it up, or it might be you've got too much and need to bring that risk down. But if you're working with an outsourced service and you don't have really strong communication channels with them, in a constant flow of communication, constant exchange of information, then they freeze and you just leave them behind within months.
Yeah, because I think sometimes people forget, and especially as I say, in those instances where you do 100% outsourcing, like, you know, pick any alert, even impossible travel. Now, how this MSP or this your partner is supposed to know what does that mean in your business terms? How do they know where the staff normally travel and where they don't? Unless you can provide that business context and provide, sort of background information behind what's happening, it's very hard to be, I guess, to be helpful to that business. And especially if there is no resource where you can communicate that. So if you go, one guy who's dealing with IT and all of the security problems, and he's a help desk and he's that, then yeah, it can be obviously very cumbersome.
I mean, I remember a conversation at a company that I worked for before I went independent, which was a very angry conversation with the CEO who couldn't get into Office 365, couldn't get into email, couldn't get into VoIP, had no official way to communicate because he had taken a sudden trip to another country. I won't
Mm.
name the country just in case that gives things away. He'd flown out there, he landed, he went in to check his email. Nope, impossible travel, you're not allowed in. Okay, I'll go to the help desk and report it. Nope, impossible travel, you're not allowed in.
Yep.
And there, you can imagine the conversation from that because he had things to do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and that's that's I guess another very important, I guess, subject we can wear in a bit. That I think I'm not necessarily proud, but I think I pushed my own organization where I think security always had a sort of a legacy mindset of you know nothing moves until it's been approved by security, or it always been no, 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 it's not safe, we're not doing that. And I'm always been sort of from the early days when I got, I guess, to the leadership position was we always say yes, but there are security requirements as a caveat that we build in for us to allow to say yes. So, how we can say yes to the business so the business can continue doing what they're doing, but we can build security requirements for us to say yes. And I think that's sort of probably the way we should be working towards.
Completely. I mean, we're decades behind health and safety. We are a long way behind them, but we really need to look at them more. I'm speaking here specifically about cyber technology and information security. Broader physical security, that's a different conversation. But health and safety isn't about saying, no, you don't do the work. It's about saying there are safe ways of working. You need to put those safe ways of working in place because otherwise people die. Now, one of the problems I still think we have in cybersecurity, technology security, is that if things go wrong, people usually don't die. That has been changing more recently. It just costs money. And many businesses go, yeah, but I can afford some money. That just stings a bit. And what we really need to do is say, yes, but if you keep on accepting that, it's going to get so bad it becomes existential. You have to put in secure ways of working the same way you'd put in safe ways of working because we need to be able to do the thing we want to do and we need to do it in a way that protects the people doing it.
Yeah, I think it's very important. And I'm constantly looking at, whether it's books, whether it's, talking with people. I think the amount of stuff, because obviously cybersecurity is what, 30 years old or so. The amount of stuff we could learn from different industries is fascinating. Even, I always talk, I always bring up examples, even from Greg's book, how, if a plane lands and there's three bolts missing, you don't just replace the bolts and send the plane on. You will try to do a root cause analysis and understand, was the bolt design bad? Was there's what happened? Why do these bolts fail? Because that's why sometimes when we're talking about cybersecurity, if we look at statistics, we spend every year more money, but the breaches keep rising. Well, obviously, we're not doing a good job. So, and I think, if we're talking, and actually, I've been discussing with someone, what's your thought about? Because I think what we need to do more is actually doing more implicit sort of controls from the get-go. So, if you look at, and simple comparison is now, if we look at organ donations across Europe, those countries that have opt out, they have a 90% uptake. Instead of those who have opt in, they maybe have 10% uptake. So things like MFA, imagine if you had opt out of MFA and MFA came in as a bog standard requirement everywhere, how much risk we could reduce and solve how many problems.
Yep, up until someone finds a way around it, but that's not going to be a quick thing. I mean, there are attacks against MFA, but they're much rarer than attacks against no MFA. So bring it in by default, particularly if you bring it in a way that's transparent and usable, or that forces people to work that way without making them too angry, because one of the best ways to break security is make people angry and they will find ways around it. But there's a lot of things we can do here in the same way, again, that health and safety do. You just put safe ways or secure ways of working in place that are expected to be followed. You make it the norm and you give people the option to opt out, but it has to be intentional to opt out of it. They have to understand the risk, they have to understand what they're going to be dealing with and what they need to be aware of if they choose to opt out.
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned this, I guess it's sometimes where, some of the stuff that came out from US regarding SEC and obviously CISOs going to prison. I think sometimes obviously the problems happen is because we either circumvent some of the processes or we lack documentation. Because as you say, if we put MFA by default and you have a proper business exception process, yes, you can turn it off, but then everything is documented and you are agreed why you decided to move away from it. So I think you, in a way, not only protect your own, sort of behind, but you build robust processes in terms of risk assessing why some of the things should, or could be circumvented.
Exactly. I mean, it's security. It is all risk management. Fundamentally, that's what it all comes down to. And to do proper risk management when you're talking about security, you've got to understand the threats. So, what are the threats against your organization? And therefore, what's the appropriate security? Now, if all my organization does is say, I don't know, it's Meals on Wheels, we deliver food to
Yeah.
people. The informational technological threats against that are pretty minimal, not just because we're not relying that much on computer systems, but also because who really wants to be the person that took down Meals on Wheels?
Yeah.
Whereas if it's a bank, if it's a financial institution, well, lots of people want to be the person who stole millions of pounds from us.
Yeah.
So understanding your threat model, taking that through and saying, well, what other risks at different points, what we can we be exposed to, and dealing with all of that and saying there are times we need to accept more risk, at least temporarily, and opt out of things and know that we're opting out of them and accept that and be intentional about it. And there's other times where you've not thought this through. Therefore, yes, you've got 2FA, you've got multi factor authentication, you've got to use a VPN, whatever it might be. But if we make secure the default, but make it possible to deliberately opt out when there's a need for it, I think it's going to be a lot less painful.
Yeah, and I think I think another problem sometimes where I foresee, and I think sometimes is misunderstood. You nicely mentioned here risk management or risk assessment. I think sometimes people forget as well. Risk assessment or even risk management normally is point in time exercise. So, what you risk assessed last month does not necessarily mean that the values or your assumptions are correct today. So it's just constantly evaluation, whether you should say whether you built an exception based on risk assessment that you've done a month ago. You need to continuously evaluate and measure your risk, and your risks, because they change via, whether it's environment, whether your attack surface change, where you've got new assets and things like that. Things change. And that's, I guess, an important lesson for some people to obviously continue, monitor, and evaluate your risks.
Yeah, we live in a dynamic world. It changes day to day, it changes hour to hour. You've got to have a way to reevaluate at any point when you need to and say, maybe we need to do this differently. Maybe we need to rethink this. Are we still doing the right thing? Because it's not necessarily enough to say, oh, something external has changed, we need to react to that. It's also, has anything internal changed? Often that's overlooked.
Yeah.
Has someone left the company, joined the company? Is there a way of working that no longer works for us? Do we need to go remote? Do we need to go in office? Is there a need for that? And constantly be reassessing that, which sounds like a lot of work, but it sounds like a lot of work because people are used to almost doing it on an annual basis, saying, oh, we review the risks annually. That's not good enough. But a 2 day meeting once a year to review the risks is useless. A 5 minute meeting once a week to review the risks gives you much more value because you can say, yeah, nothing's changed this week, we're good. Or actually, this week a lot's changed, so we're just going to stretch it out and look at how we're going to do things again. But it really is that continuous communication, that continuous review.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, I argue with people that, when someone brings, ISO 27001, whether, it improves security or not, there's obviously arguments for and against it. But I always say it's not about, if you go into the mission of just passing the audit or just getting the certificate, you can do bare minimum because it can be an on paper exercise where you build all your policies, you show the bare minimum to get the certification. But actually in live and breathe and build continuous improvement and actually bring quality, yes, it can be a great standard. But the problem is how people use it. Some organizations use it as a competitive advantage to say, oh, we're going to be able to sell our product because we will slap that our product's built by a ISO approved ISMS, but we'll just do the bare minimum to get to pass the audit.
I mean, we've got to remember certifications, they're marketing. They're not the goal. They are, or they should be, a side effect. They should be a side benefit. They are something that we get because customers demand it. But the actual structures behind them, I mean, I really like ISO 27001. It is a very solid scaffolding to build a continuous improvement information security management system on. And if you sincerely put that in place in the same way as if you do it with ISO 9001 for quality, or 14,001 if you care about environment, 45,001 health, there's loads of the things.
Yeah.
42,001 is AI now.
Yeah.
But if you're sincerely looking to put that management system in place to benefit you, the certification just happens. The problem comes when people say, I want the certification, I will do what I need to get it, but I'm not going to bother integrating it into what I do. That turns it into a lot more work than just doing it properly.
Yeah, definitely. It's, I think sometimes, yeah, it's always, I guess, split in organizations. That are those who do security for the sake of compliance or regulatory requirements, and those who actually want to do security because they want to ship secure product. And I'm always been talking, I think I'm always been fascinating by how, the view of, actually, in order to build quality, you have to do security. So security should be a quality metric. Now, if we go into a bit, I guess, different conversations, because obviously there's so many things to talk with you about. But I wanted to touch point, you probably were one of the first persons who I probably met and who were, a great mentor in cybersecurity. What led, I guess, you on a path to actually getting involved and mentoring people? Because, I think, sometimes it's really fascinating when you enter this industry, how many amazing people there are who are, actually willing to give their time and support people who on this career growth. Because some places, obviously, or some industries, then they're not really it's very hard to find that kind of community spirit.
Think for me, a lot of it is around the fact that we need more people doing this, and we need more people who actually understand security properly. And our education system and the commercial training systems are not built up to do that. There is a very old model which could actually do it a lot better, but that's been cannibalized and subverted and has turned into the modern apprenticeship system, which does still have some benefits, but it has this weird idea, for example, of if you're on any sort of modern apprenticeship, you have 1 day per week of work release. to go and study in a classroom.
Yep.
But that's not an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship is doing the work and being supervised and being led through it and having your hand held when necessary and talking through things and asking questions. It's not going to a lecture. So for me, a large part of it was we need more people. I've spent long enough in this that I can be very blunt about things and my view of the industry and get away with it. And I can also hopefully dispel some of the more theoretical aspects or the more idealistic aspects where it's, oh, you must do things this way because. I mean, as an example, we're still in a world where a large number of security people are out there advising companies that they should rotate passwords every 30 days. It's a
Yep.
silly example, but there are people still doing this. I have had debates with clients that have lasted a long time about when they do need to do this and when they don't. But it's the type of thing that if you've not been through that and thought it through and spent time on it, it's very easy to just say, oh, I've got the answer. I know exactly what it should be. So that's what I'll repeat. Instead of going, well, is it appropriate in this case? Do I need to question it? Do I need to think about it? So with the mentoring, with helping people, answering questions, all of that, it for me, it really is about I want people who will, if I say, oh, this is what you need to do, will turn around and say to me, yeah, but are you sure? Have you thought it through? Can you justify it? So that's a large part of it. And I honestly, I love this industry. I love this whole discipline. So if I find people I can talk to about it, all the better.
Yeah, and I think especially, I like what you highlighted because sometimes, there are, self-professed, cybersecurity influencers and things like that, and we all know there's obviously good and the bad as with everything. But as you kind of mentioned, I think it's important to highlight the fact that, and I think especially now with neurodivergence and how people learn, that you can't prescribe someone one specific path. And the more you can teach and I guess help people, because I guess when I probably started out as well, as most people, you always like chasing, asking people like, what's the best certificate to do? But it, I guess, learning and actually helping someone to understand that that's not the question to ask. What certificate might help you, or what's the best in this situation or that situation or in your circumstances, it's very different, I guess, to every people, and depending how you learn as well. You can't prescribe someone to read a book if they probably better consume, say, video material. So I guess that's where you kind of, you can kind of, I guess, prompt people, and as you say, try and be challenged, and that's how you people learn.
Yeah, I think one of the other problems we have is there's almost a cult of self-reliance and self-learning in security. There's this idea, oh, all the resources are out there for free. All you need to do is go out and learn from all this stuff that's out there. No one should guide you. No one should steer you. No, you shouldn't do any commercial courses. No, you shouldn't do anything academic. And it does come from the other sides as well. But people do learn differently. People understand things differently. The best way is finding the appropriate blend of paths for any particular individual. And that's not done by deciding this is the one true path for everyone. If you're not doing it this way, you're wrong, which I hear a lot of the time. It's try this. If it doesn't work for you, okay, here's something else you can try. If that doesn't work, here's something else. And maybe later on, you can go back to that first thing and suddenly find it works for you. So there's a huge problem with saying my way is the only way. Plenty of people learn very differently from me. I'd say most people probably learn differently from me and understand things differently. And that's incredibly valuable. And we need to support that. But what we can't do is say, yeah, but this is the official way. That's the only way you can go. That's the only way that's accepted.
Yeah, and I think I think you're right, and especially as you say, actually learning, understanding that there is, many, I guess, paths to success. Yeah, for example, even take simple things like, CompTIA Security Plus. People love it, people hate it, but it still gives you some lessons in there. But again, people blindly say you should do it. Well, yes, you could do it, but again, it depends where your level of knowledge is. You know, for me, I always say, if you have not been around computers, then start with A plus. You know, you have to build on networking knowledge before you go to security plus. So maybe do A plus, maybe do network plus. If you got any knowledge about computers, maybe you don't need A plus, but let's do network plus, then go in security. Because, and I think somewhere somebody mentioned actually that I think sometimes in a way that, you know, it's so hard to people jump at such an advanced level into security without understanding the basics, where it becomes really difficult if you don't understand networking, and then you go into whether it's firewall, whether it's building networks and stuff like that, and you don't understand how these, I guess, protocols work innately. You know, you whether you intentionally or not, you can build insecure solutions without understanding how it works.
Yeah. And if you don't understand the technology side, then you shouldn't be building solutions. That doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't be looking at architectures. They're different things. You know, we're talking at different levels of abstraction. So you can build a secure architecture without understanding every single detail beyond the basics of a firewall deals with access control.
Yeah.
Great. So I know I need a firewall here. I know I need an authentication solution here. I don't need to know the exact specifics of every single protocol going through that authentication system. I don't need to know OAuth inside and out. And most people in security don't anyway.
Yeah.
But it's knowing what you don't know and being able to pull on the experts who work with you or don't work with you to say, I'm being asked about this thing. Can I have some support with it? And it isn't all technical. I would argue it is all about systems. Systems can be non-technical, technical or otherwise, but they're basically about components that interact. And so everyone in security should understand systems, but the depth to which they understand them, that will depend on the role that you're sitting in. A CISO doesn't have to understand how to program a firewall. I know that's controversial.
Yep.
Not all CISOs need to be technical,
Yep.
but a firewall engineer needs to understand how a firewall works. These are both security roles. A firewall engineer does not need to know how to build a privileged access management solution or a secrets vault or something like that,
Yep.
because that's another specialist role. But the CISO needs to understand that a secrets vault is useful when you need to do this sort of thing. And what I need to do then is get someone who is a PAM consultant and drop them into that hole and say, go do this. Let me know anything I need to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, it's very important, I guess, lesson here as well. You know, we're talking about, you know, in security development, you know, I've been, you know, in early days through interviews where I've been, you know, questioned about what does port 58 do? What does port 389 do? And, you know, I was really questioning that, you know, the people's leadership or their interviewing skills, because, you know, I think security is not about memorization. You know, who cares what port does what? Everyone can Google that. But actually understanding that, you know, instead of using 23 port, you would use 22 because it's encrypted. You know, that's where, and you know, and I think it's very important. And I read somewhere, and I think it really means, and I think it's really important nowadays with the proliferation of AI, human intelligence value is going to increase over time tremendously, because everything is becoming so generic that your ability to think independently is going to get more valuable by the time.
Yeah, I mean, information retrieval. I remember back in the old days, uh, the very old days, where we suddenly had this new thing called a search engine,
Yep.
and everyone's IT job was going to be replaced by just Googling everything or Yahooing everything or asking Jeeves,
Yep.
which was largely true because you could do that. It was absolutely fine to do that. But knowing what to look for was a huge piece, because you can't just say to it, I've got this situation, solve it for me. You have to be able to get to the point that you're asking the right questions. And I don't think the modern AI, the LLMs and chatbots, have got that much further. They're a little more able to interpret the questions, but really not that much. They are information retrieval engines and they hallucinate wildly.
Yeah, and I think it's an important message. I always talk to people. I think people who are in this sort of AI race, I think organizations that are building AI tools to replace humans are getting it very wrong. you should be looking for solutions how you can enhance human output and support humans and essentially enable them to do more. That's how I think you're going to win. But you trying to replace humans, I think that's a bad bet. And anyone's working in that space, I think they're going to fail miserably.
Yeah, the clue's in the name. They're AI tools. You don't just leave a hammer on the floor and expect it to go start knocking nails in. It's a
Yeah.
tool, it's not the solution.
Yeah, you're definitely right. You touched upon, I guess, a few other, important subjects in there, and I think, another important, whether it's a skill, whether however you look at it, but I think, nowadays, public speaking is such a overlooked, I guess, skill or experience that, even when I'm, mentoring, junior talents, I always say, try and get involved as early as possible in possibilities to do public speaking, because I think whether you like it or not, no matter, I think, I honestly believe that no matter how great your idea is, unless you can influence decision makers with your idea, your idea might not reach ever a day of light. So, what's your thought about public speaking, and how do you, how are you working to help people, I guess, to break out and be comfortable with, public speaking? What are the, how people can essentially help themselves to get there?
So I still think it's probably one of the most powerful skill sets that people can learn because it's about communication.
Yeah.
And that means it's about communicating information. And ultimately, all we do is exchange information. There's the maths on this. Information is the exchange of stuff which will affect someone's behavior. So that's the whole thing. But with public speaking in particular, it's challenging, which makes it valuable in itself. Anything worth doing is difficult. And it's supposedly a greater fear than death for most people. I'm skeptical about that, but it's a nice statistic all the same. But learning the skills to be able to communicate effectively to a large audience or even a small audience from a stage where you are trying to relate something that will make a change in their behavior is probably one of the most valuable skills you can pick up in security or anything else. Now, in security, even if you're in a more technical role, being able to explain why it should be done this way to the people who make the decision on whether or not you can do it that way is really important. And that means you have to be able to pick up and understand and speak their language. It's not good enough to just say, oh, we need to close down port 22 or we need to close down port 666 because otherwise we're all doomed. That's a joke for some people who know
Yeah.
their port numbers. You have to be able to say why that matters, what the consequences are otherwise, and you have to do it in language which relates to your audience. So I think everyone should do public speaking more, at least once. There are in security plenty of conferences, plenty of events where you can go and submit. And as a first time speaker, you will get support, you will get encouragement, you will get mentoring if you want it, you will have people helping to build your slides. It's incredibly useful to do that. It's great for your CV as well. The way that I do it is usually by going to things like B-sides or directly working with people one-on-one to help them build presentations and prepare for their first talk or their 50th talk, whichever one it might be. Because I've worked with people who've just gone to give their first talk at a B-sides. I've worked with people who are helping to put shape to their first presentation to the board 30 years into their career.
Yeah.
And they really need to communicate in the right way. So that's the main thing I do around it. But being able to translate between yourself or the people behind you and an audience is just incredibly powerful to effect change.
Yeah, and I think we kind of touched upon earlier around fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or as we call FUD, and I think that's the problem. You have some CISOs who go into their board presentations with FUD and scary statistics to get budget, but actually you being able to be a storyteller and create a narrative where it helps the organization, or because the thing is and as we kind of I think touched earlier, I think sometimes it's even more important that you don't necessarily always need to chase the bigger budget. Sometimes you have to look at see how you can squeeze more stuff out of the budget, and how you can help the organization. If the business is not going well, nobody's going to give you extra money. So how you can do better security with less money. But yeah, as you say, there is B-sides, there's various events who are, helping there to I guess to build the skills. One of my first jobs how I got is because I've done my first public speaking event, and it's I think it's amazing, and it opens so many opportunities for people. And I think I would like to actually hear your thoughts sometimes. And I always say to people, like, especially those who starting out, try and become a teacher. So whether it's your significant other, your brother, your sister, mom, teach the subjects that you are learning. And if you can translate them to someone who's completely non-technical, you're going to do well. And for some reason, I always find that, especially when I did various mentoring assignments, people who come from teaching background, they do very well in those subjects, in terms of, like, public speaking, or actually being able to translate technical speak into sort of, people that can understand.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly valuable. I mean, I've worked with boot camps, I've worked with universities, I've done training in various other places, but honestly, if you have the opportunity to teach something, it's a really valuable thing to do. And that's not necessarily just because, oh, I get to teach people and enlighten them. It's also because they ask interesting questions. They challenge you. They have different modes of thought. I have never learned as much as when I've been teaching people.
No.
That's the it's selfish. I love to go out and teach people because they give me new ways of looking at things and new ways of thinking about things, and they ask me the right questions to force me to think and force me to understand what it is I'm saying. So yeah, teaching's quite selfish. You can learn so much by teaching.
Yeah, and I think it's very important. We keep talking about, I think it's just, teaching can potentially bring diversity of thought, because people coming from different walks of life can bring different perspectives where sometimes you probably never even thought about it. Last couple of subjects I wanted to touch as well. We talked about, I guess, public speaking, teaching, mentoring. Another place I know you're quite heavily involved is, I guess, play secure or gamification. So, I know you do quite a lot of work of, working about, sort of cyber response readiness, or doing tabletop exercises. So I guess gamification really comes into play in that sort of arena. So, how do you think people can play on that gamification to enhance whether their readiness against certain things, or how can they deploy essentially gamification maybe to improve cybersecurity awareness programs and things like that?
So gamification gets a bit of a bad name because people think it just means I'll give it points, a scoreboard, and gold stars, but it's actually about applying game-like elements to training, learning, development. So I tend to just say it's games or serious games or immersive learning or experiential learning, but there's a lot you can do with it. You can go through all the phishing simulations you want, all of the phishing testing you want, but sitting down with people and saying, this is the consequence, this is what plays out after that. How do you respond? How do you respond? How do you communicate to clients that this has happened? It's completely different from, oh, well, you clicked the wrong link, you lose 5 points. So that sort of immersive extension of training is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and I think especially if you sort of bring in the because usually what happens is with certain exercises such as fishing or whatever, if you don't bring in the consequence or the narrative of what happens if in certain scenarios, I think they can be so much more productive in teaching. And I think another very important point is, whether you agree, it's um how do we do carrot and essentially and a sort of and a stick environment. And it's interesting, I guess, would be to hear from your thoughts, because sometimes I think some organizations or some people who start, producing their cybersecurity programs, they are measuring, I guess, the wrong thing. And if you always punish people who, whether, they're opening links or they're doing something, wrong, it can mean that obviously it's limited uptake in your cybersecurity program. So James just gonna wait for a second, so we'll wait for a sec just to round it off the episode. There we go. Sorry, we
Sorry.
just I was gonna say we just rounded up last thought, but I guess I was just talking about we talked a bit about gamification. I think the key point is about these programs is as well. It's how you measure or how you do the programs, because I think carrot and a stick is very important. Point is, if you do too much stick, I think it in my opinion, it never works, because if you start doing into, I always say to people, like some people saying, when you do phishing exercises where you put, for example, say a file that says salaries, and say, yeah, but threat actors don't care. I say, yeah, I understand, but why you would intentionally try and upset your workforce by doing such a phishing scenarios? And I think you would never do that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, some of the phishing scenarios out there, the here's a gift voucher. Oh, here's the raise you're getting. We've all seen those phishing scenarios. That's not a phishing test. That is how to build Insider Threat 101.
No.
If you upset your workforce, you're not solving anything. You are making a bigger problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I completely agree. And sorry for disappearing. I had to stop a cat killing itself.
No, that's fine. And I guess that's, and that's why I say sometimes, I think it's really important. And I always say to people, I guess that's the beauty of doing things live. But on the flip side, we having a genuine and decent conversation. There's so many things, as we know, as we touched on kind of human intelligence nowadays, everything is getting to a point where they are, scripted and predetermined to a point where it loses its, you know, natural flow, or sometimes things happen. That's I guess that's life. That's how we're doing things live. But I guess just to round it off, really really enjoy the conversation with you, James. And I guess from our audience as well, should they need or should they wish to find extra help with, whether it's public speaking, whether they would want to in their organization to do some tabletop exercises or some help with a consultancy, how they connect with with yourself, James, how they can find out more about Boars and what you guys do.
Well, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn because it's an unusual name. I think there's four of us in the UK, and I may be the only one on LinkedIn wearing an orange hat. So look for the orange hat.
Yep.
Um, Otherwise, by yourself, obviously. But the other option is turn up to our B-sides. I seem to keep on going to them, so that's always a place to meet me.
Yeah, definitely. I'm getting involved in a few B-sides as well. And as we kind of touched, I guess, earlier, those of you people, especially I guess if there's any junior ones who are looking to, to engage or do public speaking, there's most of the B-sides nowadays run a junior tracks and are actually getting involved as well to help, juniors to get prepared for their, first presentation. So I think that's the perfect sort of way to actually, you know, expose yourself, I guess, to new experiences and learn and potentially, gain an entry or a role into the industry. So, but, thank you very much for coming along, James. It was an amazing episode as always, pleasure to chat with you. You're doing some amazing things in obviously in the industry and obviously helping and mentoring so many more breakthrough talent that are coming along. So thank you for coming along.
Thank you for the opportunity.